There are good surgical candidates. There are also, unfortunately, too many people who get surgery and it either doesn't help them or it may even make them worse.
That was the voice of Aaron Gani, the founder and CEO of BehaVR, explaining why virtual reality is an important alternative to surgery for many patients dealing with chronic pain and behavioral health conditions. You're listening to How I Transform This, presented by Virsys12. Virsys12 is the award-winning Salesforce Gold consulting partner focused on healthcare innovation nationwide. In this episode, Aaron describes the innovative work his company is doing to provide VR solutions for problems like chronic pain, chronic stress, and addiction. He also offers insights into the long-term change we can expect to see in healthcare after COVID-19.
This transformation was a long time coming. It would have been nice if it wasn't through such a crisis, but we got to make the most of it in the most positive way possible and rethink elements of our system that are broken, and digital therapeutics will certainly be a big part of that, but so will many other digital elements of the value chain.
I'm your host, Clark Buckner, and along with Virsys12 founder and CEO Tammy Hawes, each episode we're seeking out healthcare technology industry leaders, exploring stories of success through the transformation of healthcare. For more stories like this, visit Virsys12.com/podcast. Now let's jump in.
Hi, I'm Aaron Gani, the founder and CEO of BehaVR.
Aaron, thank you so much for taking the time to jump on here with me and Tammy on another episode of How I Transform This.
Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aaron. I'm really excited about today's episode with you because it will be so relevant, and you're one of the most brilliant technologists and leaders that I've met, and have some very thought-provoking and technology that I think maybe even a year or so ago seemed futuristic, but today virtual reality is our new reality. So I'm excited to hear more about what you're doing.
So we know we are in some just unbelievable times right now. We definitely don't really know what the future holds at the moment. We just, everyone is kind of in a holding pattern, it seems like, and we're virtualizing things we never really thought we would in the past. But through all of these challenges, something we do know is in times of constraint and challenge, a lot of times we see entrepreneurs and we see new industries. We see a lot of some good that can come out of challenging times. And with what you do with VR, especially as it relates to behavioral health, as I understand it, there's a lot of things to talk about today. So before we dive into what you're working on and how you're driving transformation, could you give us just a really quick, just 1-2 minute snapshot of your background, and especially in healthcare tech, and then we'll jump into what you're working on today and what that might mean for the future.
Sure, happy to. So I'm a lifelong technologist going all the way back to childhood, have loved computers and everything that we can do and create with them since I encountered them early in life. And, while change is constant, the rate of change is not, and we're all living through that right now. But, while Tammy and I are both young, we're old enough to have lived through some of these waves of technological change, right? So at least I have, living through waves like the personal computer revolution, and when mobility was new and cloud computing was new, and, analytics and big data, take your pick. Those waves of technological change have been more constant and predictable than the rate of change in the world around us. But if we think about economic and sort of societal changes, we can think about maybe the dot-com bubble bursting. We think about 9/11. We can think about 2008 and the financial crisis, and now we've got this incredible healthcare shift going on. The intersection is fascinating, and it's an opportunity. I have been, throughout my career, lucky to be in positions where day in and day out, I got the opportunity to take those waves of technological change and apply them to the business challenge of the day. In financial services for many years, in healthcare starting in 2006 when I joined Humana, and I was with Humana for 12 years where I was in technology and innovation roles, and when I left I was the CTO there. And so I've always loved this opportunity to take the incredible creative power and transformational power of technology and apply it to these business or societal changes that are upon us. And right now is no different. In fact, maybe the only way it's different is maybe the magnitude or scale of what I think is about to happen in healthcare. And certainly don't have a crystal ball, but we can talk about what that might look like.
So Aaron, please share with us about your company and what you guys are focused on.
Certainly. So BehaVR, I founded it in 2016 to focus on creating digital wellness and digital therapeutic products for behavioral health. At the time, I had been with Humana for 10 years and had come to believe that the behavioral health challenge is so big with so much unmet need in our society and so many obstacles to care that it absolutely needed a new solution. And further, when we look at the challenges of behavioral health and sort of intersect that with the chronic disease burden in our population, the folks who are dealing with some level of chronic disease burden and an unmanaged behavioral health condition are the most challenged, most expensive people in our whole healthcare system with enormous pain and suffering. So it was the biggest problem I could think of in healthcare, with a huge amount of human sort of pain and suffering and opportunity to reduce that, and a huge amount of value to be unlocked. So what we set out to do was build these digital interventions using a full technology stack of things that you'd probably expect, like cloud computing and analytics and health data interoperability and so on, but with one critical ingredient of virtual reality because of the unique psychological and neurological power of the VR medium. So today we have programs to address chronic pain, actively combating chronic stress, and a program that augments addiction recovery programs. And then we are also working on some digital therapeutics with some pharma partners that will be in spaces like anxiety, depression, PTSD, and other areas in the future.
So Aaron, that is very timely. I mean, it was timely before we went into the current COVID crisis that we have. And there are a lot of really staggering predictions about what mental health impacts might occur based on COVID. Do you tell us more? Because pain, stress, drug addiction, anxiety. So how does that actually look? So if I am a patient that is suffering with anxiety, what would my virtual experience look like?
So you're right, it's a huge problem. We talk a little bit about the scale of the problem when I introduce my company and products to potential clients or investors, and just a few data points to give you a sense of it. 1 in 5 people in the U.S. deal with a behavioral health challenge, a diagnosable condition in any given year. It's 1 in 7 globally. Of those who are diagnosed, only about 40% or so get any kind of care at all. And then there are huge impacts in terms of lost productivity and the pain and suffering from that and so on. So a huge challenge. There are not enough behavioral health professionals, a lot of caring, wonderful people out there who are trying to help, but there just aren't enough of them to go around. So we need these digital interventions. So what we do in our programs, when you're using virtual reality, you got to be very specific about why you're using virtual reality, right? There's a huge amount of friction with VR. While most all of us have a smartphone in our pocket, almost nobody has a VR headset. So you better have a really good reason for why you want to deal with that extra friction and challenge. Well, it turns out that VR is incredibly powerful for creating experiences. So we can engineer experiences for people that, in a nutshell, and I won't go deep into the neuroscience of it in a podcast, but the brain experiences it essentially as real because it's coming in through those same sensory pathways that our real-life experiences do. And what we can do with that is a few key things. First, we teach people to detect and manage their own state of arousal. If I'm a little bit more clinical, I'd say we help them activate their parasympathetic nervous system response. If I say it real simply, help them calm down. VR is almost magical in its ability to help people do that. From there, we build stress resilience and non-reactivity. So the things that might otherwise trigger them back into that stress response, which for short periods is fine, it's not a big deal, but chronic activation of that stress response is actually very damaging and ripples through the body in a whole number of unhelpful ways. So we build resilience and non-reactivity. And then the final tier is we can actually disarm those triggers through various forms of exposure therapy and extinction, which is a neurological process that we understand from talk therapy. But in VR, you can do it through simulated environments that we have a huge amount of control over, from intensity to content to duration to logging interactions and eye tracking and biometrics and other things. So we're helping people with the connection between how they experience things that challenge them, that are stressful or traumatic, and how they deal with that and how it affects them physiologically.
I definitely need one of these VR headsets myself.
We kind of all do right now.
Really? That's a really good point. Tammy, I think that is spot on. The questions I'm thinking about as relates to VR, we've been hearing about VR for a while now. What do you think is different today than it was maybe just a couple of years ago?
Yeah, VR is not all that new. Been around in research and lab settings for a couple of decades, even in medical applications with clinical studies and other things. The current era that we're living in, this sort of consumer grade era of VR, kicked off around 2014 when the Oculus Kickstarter campaign happened, and then Facebook acquired Oculus, and that sort of set off a capital inflow and a bit of a gold rush. Many people expected at the time that around 2016 or 17 it would just explode. You know, it would be like the next smartphone and everybody would have this. Well, that did not happen. So then some folks are feeling like, well, so maybe VR has sort of flopped again. Actually, while it's undeniable, it's not growing at the rate of the fastest growing consumer technologies. What is happening is incredible advances, every 9 months or so with the equipment and that allows us to create amazing experiences in the field. The other thing that's happening that's not so visible is there is a large and growing enterprise market for applications like embodied learning scenarios and simulations and training surgeons, and this is when in healthcare, some incredible companies. I won't try and go into all that right now, but many enterprise use cases and healthcare use cases where some really incredible experiences are being created, and that's what VR is best at, is experiences that we can't live in any other way. I'll just give you one example that's really powerful. There's a company called Surgical Theater that will take 3D imaging and create 3D models that a surgeon and or patients and the patient's family members can sort of go into in VR and fly through pre-surgically. So this is useful in a couple of ways. For patients and families, it helps them sort of demystify the process, reduce anxiety, increases their confidence that their physicians actually have, a plan of action or attack. For surgeons, it is amazing how it changes their planning process. So we have a colleague and advisor, Dr. Rob Lewis at Hoag Hospital in Newport Beach. He's a non-invasive brain surgeon, or minimally invasive, sorry, it is invasive, minimally invasive brain surgeon. He plans his brain surgeries with the Surgical Theater VR product by going in VR, rotating the brain around, figuring out where to cut the hole in the skull and how to go in. It is mind-blowingly cool when you see it, and you come away saying, there is no way I or anyone in my family would go through a brain surgery where they didn't have this technology, right? So this is one example of, with this new medium, we can engage in things that we just couldn't do even a very few years ago.
What kind of traction have you seen so far from what you're describing?
So for our company, I gave you an example of a simulation training surgical planning tool. That's one use of the technology. We're operating in a very different space. As I mentioned earlier, we're in the behavioral health space. We're helping people with stress resilience, non-reactivity, disarming triggers. We wrap that in the context of some health challenge that people face. So our most mature product is our pain neuroscience education program. And this is for people who are either already suffering from chronic pain or they are at risk of developing chronic pain, say in a perioperative setting, right, pre-surgically. So we have clinical partners, a company called Confluent Health. Dr. Adrian Lowe is a PhD and PT there who spent 15 years of his life researching chronic pain and how you teach people about how pain really works in the body and the role of the nervous system versus the brain, et cetera, et cetera. We teach the patients about this in VR. that is this really cool, engaging experience with 3D models and animations and physician holograms and all this cool stuff. That's part of it. That's the education pillar. But then having equipped them with that better understanding, we teach them those skills of non-reactivity, of modulating the pain themselves, mindfulness practice, etc. And that's where the medium of VR is really extra powerful. So that is our most mature program. We're in 150 or so sites. We've serviced a little over 3,000 patients now with some wonderful results. We've got our first randomized controlled trial results far exceeding minimum clinically important differences. 70+% of patients doing much better after just 3 sessions. I mean, it is sort of dramatic, the effect that you can have with the right evidence base, like all of that pain neuroscience education content that we got from our partners, coupled with this new medium and this new environment to help people build these skills of resilience and self-management and so on. So other programs as well. But the most encouraging thing for me is that we're out in the market, we're learning about how you deploy these technologies, how do you use the medium, how do you engage clinicians in that and consumers in that. When you're building something digital, I mean, Tammy, you know this, you've got to iterate. You know, you don't get it right the first time. You get it every sprint, every couple of weeks. These products are getting better and better and smarter. And that's one of the things that's so cool about a digital therapy. I like a quote I heard from somebody a few years ago that said, imagine if drugs got smarter every time we took them. Well, that's sort of what we have as an opportunity with these digital health products and digital therapeutics is we're out in the world, we're collecting data about patient interaction, engagement, and iterating, and it gets better, every sprint.
So, Aaron, do you see a day where this type of technology could completely eliminate the need for surgery for specifically pain?
I don't think so, Tammy. I think that particularly in the area of neck and back pain, it's the number one category of spending in the U.S., at least it was in 2016. It's incredible the burden that this places on society in terms of pain and suffering as well as spend. There is definitely a segment of the population that goes through a care pathway that is invasive, expensive, and ultimately not very effective. And it typically goes like some imaging, like MRIs, maybe some injections, some opioids, which of course carries a significant risk, and surgeries. There are good surgical candidates. There are also, unfortunately, too many people who get surgery and it either doesn't help them or it may even make them worse. In many cases, people get worse and they can spiral down in a very negative path. And so what we're excited about is the opportunity working with our partners in the physical therapy space and our payer partners, which is part of the value chain, right? So we're saying to our payer clients, we want to intervene with a new alternative care pathway that will reduce your spend on imaging, injections, opioids, surgeries, and get your patients or your members, in the case of the health plan, a better, more safer, more effective outcome. This is one of those examples of where everybody wins in the system, right? So what we see happening is more people get the right care for them. There are people who can benefit from surgery. Let's get them on sort of a faster path there, but let's use the rest of the system more efficiently.
That's fascinating. And I'm especially interested in the stress management. There is a lot of money going into natural ways to reduce stress and instead of taking medications. So this seems like a perfect opportunity for this technology to be used along with even meditation. Have you done anything in that regard?
Yes, in fact, guided meditation and mindfulness practice is a part of what we do in our programs. So we think about 3 pillars. There's educational content, which I referenced earlier. There's motivational content, which is things like motivational interviewing, which we do digitally. We don't do it as well as humans do, but we still do a decent job of helping the patient think about, how this is impacting their life and which path forward they think is going to work best for them and why they want to make these changes in their life and so on. We also share patient narratives. So think about in VR, somebody is there with you and you're hearing their story about how they faced what you're facing, how they overcame. So you can get a sense of, okay, I'm understood, I'm not alone, and others have been through this path successfully. And then the activations that I talked about are things like the mindfulness practice, the emotion regulation, skill building, building non-reactivity, and so on. But that's just my company, BehaVR. Generally, there are a number of players in this somewhat nascent but kind of burgeoning digital therapeutic space, using things. Typically, it's smartphone based, sometimes tablets. There's some of us doing things in VR, and there's a blend even going on. But broadly speaking, I spoke a few minutes ago about how we have this huge unmet need with behavioral health care. When we're not addressing that effectively, lots of pain and suffering, lots of impact on healthcare utilization and spend, which is unsustainable in the U.S. and increasingly globally. So we need new techniques that will both increase access to care, take down the barriers, and do it much more cheaply, right? Orders of magnitude cheaper than doing just interventions with human therapists. That's what digital tools can do. So it allows us to cast this very wide net, get far more people onto a support system. And, some of us, I may be okay with just a purely digital support experience. Maybe Clark needs a coach or a peer support. And Tammy, maybe you need a counselor, and somebody else needs a therapist or a psychiatrist. So we can sort of triage within these digital solutions and increase everyone's access while we do that in the most cost-effective way possible, sort of tailored to each individual. So it's a pretty exciting space. And when you think about what's going to happen in this post-COVID world, which I'd love to hear your all's thoughts on, it's only going to be more in demand. We better get ready because there's going to be a huge wave of additional anxiety and stress going on in our societies.
That stress and anxiety, it's unimaginable what it's going to look like. I mean, at the moment we're recording this, we've been kind of self-isolating and hunkered down for a couple weeks, but I mean, it looks like everything's indicating this is going to be a much longer ride. And earlier you were talking about examples like to Tammy, like, hey, you've got to pivot, and you're sharing some examples of like, what if a drug got smarter every time you took it? So as we're starting to think about these ideas around improvement and pivoting and changing, I'm curious, do you think what you're doing in VR, or do you anticipate any changes in the VR industry, using kind of air quotes here, I guess that you could call it an industry, right? How do you see that changing because of COVID-19 and a world becoming much more virtual for several upcoming months? I mean, I don't know if it, again, like you said earlier, we don't have a crystal ball, but I'm just kind of curious, now that the world has seen this, I'm curious if it will change how you're driving innovation and transformation.
Yeah, I think it's less about any one technology, whether that's virtual reality, augmented reality, what we do on our smartphones, what have you. Certainly there's been this explosion in telehealth, where a lot of the controls, from CMS and the federal government have been relaxed, at least for the short term, right? Because it was a matter not just of convenience, but of safety. We don't want people going into hospitals and other clinical settings for all these, care encounters. Those of us working remotely, many of us are using now, Zoom and video conferencing and other things that maybe we weren't using as much before. But all those changes, they're not driven by the technology, right? They're driven by the user experience. And I think, and the demands, like what do we need today? What do Tammy and I need right now to be able to run our companies in this fully virtual mode, for example, right? And so I think that in healthcare, it's going to be really interesting to see, hopefully, the value chain shift towards a consumer-centric value chain finally. Because one could argue that healthcare is like the holdout, right? So much of our lives is transformed already digitally, whether it's ride hailing or, delivery services and gig economy stuff and you name it. And healthcare has been stubbornly resistant to change, where the consumer, the patient, is expected to adapt to how the healthcare system works. And we all just get told this is how it works, right? And that has flipped. And now we're all going to want care probably in our homes more than ever. But certainly where and when we want it, we're going to be thinking about safety. And so I think that it's going to be hard to predict, but the brick and mortar healthcare system is going to be repurposed towards what it probably should have been, in my opinion. When you need a hospital, you need some sort of urgent, primary, tertiary, secondary care, whatever. you need that. But there's so much of what we get in healthcare where we are expected to align to the old brick and mortar system and value chain that is now going to be completely redefined, I think.
Yes, I agree. I mean, if you look at what's going on today, these health systems and hospitals don't want you coming in unless you absolutely have to. And they're doing a lot more via telephone and telehealth. And I can see in the future VR and all the technologies that you're bringing to bear.
Yeah, and Tammy, you're probably seeing this from your clients as well. I mean, I read just yesterday a story about some of the incredibly rapid transformations happening up at Geisinger in Pennsylvania. I happen to know the CEO there, Dr. Jaewon Ryu. He and I were Humana colleagues, and he's a fabulous guy, and it doesn't surprise me at all that he and his team are so adaptive and responsive, but just completely changing patient experience and flow on a dime, because that's what this public health crisis requires. Yeah, the pace of change in technology, like it wasn't fast enough. I mean, and it's not going to be because there's a new widget or gadget or VR headset, right? It's going to be because the society or customer value chain or our business imperatives or whatever are just demanding it from us.
Well, that's correct. And I think that the winners in this, if there are any winners, will be those that can move quickly and agile and in a way that really responds to the demands of the patient. And so I guess fortunately or unfortunately, we'll see what happens in the next couple of months.
Yeah. Well, we'll certainly get through it, and nobody welcomes this. But you're right. I think there is opportunity. And with healthcare, you know, it's beyond a nice business opportunity. It's like we've needed to transform healthcare for a long time. I mean, that's when you and I met, Tammy, in the Nashville Healthcare Council Fellows Program. That was really the theme, right? Is what are we all doing to transform this somewhat broken and ineffective system? And this will certainly accelerate it. So I guess that'll be the silver lining out of all this.
I like being able to end on an optimistic outlook. Anything else you want to leave us with? If you had to boil everything down into just one optimism that you feel going into the future, is there any way you'd like to kind of wrap up everything you've shared with us and a final thought?
Well, I think healthcare has, as we've said, it's been so resistant to change. And the scale of this like global public health crisis will show us things about what did work. You know, there's all the heroism of the individual people working in the system, but the system itself, particularly in the U.S., is sort of showing its deficiencies and cracks and inefficiencies. And so this transformation was a long time coming. It would have been nice if it wasn't through such a crisis, but we got to make the most of it in the most positive way possible and rethink elements of our system that are broken. And digital therapeutics will certainly be a big part of that, but so will many other digital elements of the value chain. So it's exciting to see what's going to come from that.
Aaron, thank you so much for taking the time to share a little about your story, share about what you're working on and how it is going to make for a better future. What's a good way for someone to connect with you and your team?
Well, you can find us online at BehaVR.com. It's BehaVR.com. And of course, we're on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and so on. But yeah, we'd love to engage with anyone who's interested in what we're doing. And we love partnering to create new solutions with folks in this system. So
thank you so much, Aaron, for the great work you're doing and the innovative thought that you're bringing to the industry. And we just really appreciate your time today.
Well, you're very welcome. And thanks again for the invitation. It's great being with you.
Thanks for listening to How I Transform This, Success Stories of Transformation in Healthcare, presented by Virsys12. To learn more about how Virsys12 is best situated to transform the healthcare industry and to follow along with this show, be sure to visit Virsys12.com/podcast. We'll see you next time.